The world was fading. His body ached, too weak to move. The cold bit into his skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the hunger, the exhaustion, the betrayal. Once he had a purpose. Once he had a home. Now he was just another forgotten soul, left to rot in the dirt. But his heart still beat. His spirit still burned. He would not give up. And just as the darkness closed in, headlights cut through the night, and fate gave him one last chance. The winter morning was unforgiving. A thick layer of frost clung to the barren trees lining the deserted road, and the wind carried an icy bite that made even the strongest shiver. Mark Jensen, a retired police officer, drove his old pickup truck along the familiar stretch of highway leading out of town. He had made this drive countless times before, going to the gas station, running errands, sometimes just to clear his head. But this time, something was different. At first it looked like nothing more than a pile of debris, just another forgotten object discarded on the roadside. But something made Mark slow down. His instincts, honed from years on the force, whispered to him that something was wrong. He narrowed his eyes, peering through the windshield as he passed the dark shape, and then, just for a moment, he saw it. A slight movement, barely perceptible. His heart clenched. Mark pulled over, his tires crunching against the frozen ground. He threw the truck into park and stepped out, immediately feeling the sharp sting of cold air against his face. The wind carried the faint scent of decay, of something suffering. As he approached, he realized what he was looking at. A German shepherd, collapsed in the dirt, unmoving. The sight of the dog sent a painful jolt through him. Mark knelt beside the dog, his pulse quickening. He could hear the shallow, labored breathing, each inhale a battle, each exhale a whisper of pain. The dog's coat, once thick and noble, was caked with dirt and dried blood. It had been suffering for a long time. Memories hit Mark like a tidal wave. Years ago, when he was still on the force, he had a canine partner, a German shepherd named Rex. Rex had been more than just a police dog. He had been family, a companion who had saved his life more than once, but in the end Mark couldn't save him. Rex had taken a bullet for him during a high-stakes raid, and the grief of losing him had never truly left. And now here he was, staring at another shepherd, broken and abandoned. A lump formed in Mark's throat. No, not again. He hesitated for only a second before making a decision. He wouldn't leave this dog here to die alone. Carefully, he removed his jacket and wrapped it around the frail body. The dog whimpered at the touch but didn't resist. It was too weak to fight. With a grunt, Mark lifted the dog into his arms. It was lighter than it should have been, far too light. "Hang in there, buddy," Mark murmured, voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." He carried the shepherd back to his truck and gently placed him on the passenger seat. The dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed and dull. Mark reached out and rested a hand on its head, feeling the slight tremor in its body. "You're safe now," he whispered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and Mark sped off towards town, his mind racing. There was only one person he trusted with this, Dr. Lucy Carter, the town's veterinarian. The vet clinic. By the time Mark pulled up outside Lucy's clinic, the dog's breathing had grown shallower. He wasted no time, scooping the shepherd into his arms and pushing through the glass doors. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and warmth, a stark contrast to the freezing world outside. A bell jingled as he entered, and Lucy, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a kind heart, turned from the counter. "Mark?" she said, startled. Then she saw the dog in his arms, and her expression hardened with concern. "Bring him in, now." Mark followed her into the examination room, carefully laying the shepherd onto the table. The dog barely reacted. Mark clenched his fists. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn with anger. Lucy continued her examination, speaking in a calm voice meant to reassure both the dog and herself. "I'll get him on fluids immediately. We need to stabilize him. It's a miracle he's still alive." Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. Can he recover? Lucy hesitated before answering. Physically, yes, if we act fast, but mentally, that depends on him and on you. Mark nodded. He had already made his decision. He wasn't leaving this dog's side. A promise. Over the next hour, Lucy and her team worked tirelessly. They inserted an IV, cleaned the wounds, wrapped the worst of the injuries. The dog remained still through it all, his body too weak to fight back. But there was something else, something Mark noticed when he looked into those deep, tired eyes. A will to live. This dog had been through hell. He had been beaten, starved, discarded like trash, and yet he had kept going. Mark leaned in, resting a gentle hand on the shepherd's head. "You're a fighter," he murmured. "I see it in you." The dog's ears twitched slightly, as if responding to his voice. Lucy smiled faintly. "Do you want to name him?" Mark looked at the shepherd for a long moment. He thought about Rex. He thought about second chances. And then, softly, he said, "Max." Lucy nodded. "Max it is." The name felt right. Mark didn't know what lay ahead, whether Max would ever trust humans again, whether he would ever heal completely. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to give up on Max. And deep down he hoped that maybe, just maybe, Max wouldn't give up on him either. The dim glow of the clinic's emergency lights cast long shadows across the walls as Mark sat beside Max's kennel, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the IV machine. The German shepherd lay curled on the soft blanket Lucy had provided, his frail body rising and falling with each shallow breath. His wounds had been cleaned, his ribs no longer exposed beneath layers of grime and neglect, but the battle was far from over. Max had made it through the night. That was the first victory. Mark exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. He hadn't left the clinic since bringing Max in the day before. He refused to. There was something about this dog, something in the way he fought against death, refusing to let go despite everything. It reminded Mark of himself, of the dark times he had barely crawled out of after leaving the force. Lucy stepped into the room, holding a clipboard against her chest. Her expression was unreadable as she checked Max's vitals. "He's stable," she said, her voice soft. "But it's going to be a long road." Mark nodded. He already knew that. Lucy glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You can't save them all, you know." Mark met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I can save this one." Lucy sighed, but didn't argue. Instead, she set the clipboard down and knelt beside Max, running a gentle hand over his coat. The dog flinched, his muscles tensing, his ears flattening. It was a small movement, but it said everything. Even in safety, Max expected pain. Mark clenched his fists. What kind of person could do this to an animal? "It's not just his body that's broken," Lucy murmured as if reading his thoughts. "His mind, his trust, it's all been shattered." Mark swallowed hard. He had seen trauma before. He had lived through it. He knew the road to recovery wasn't just about healing wounds. It was about learning to believe in kindness again. And Max? Max had never known kindness to begin with. The first steps to healing. The next few days passed in a blur of slow progress and quiet moments. Max remained wary, his eyes flicking toward every movement, every shift of shadow. He ate, but only when Mark left the room. He drank water hesitantly, as if expecting it to be taken away. And every time Mark or Lucy reached for him, he braced himself, waiting for the inevitable strike. But no strike ever came. Instead, Mark sat on the floor, speaking in soft tones. He read the newspaper out loud, letting his voice fill the silence. He whittled small wooden figures, a habit he had picked up after retiring. Sometimes he simply sat there, doing nothing at all. He let Max see that hands weren't just for hurting, that voices didn't always mean danger, that patience wasn't a trap. It took 4 days before Max ate from Mark's hand. It was a small victory, but Mark treated it like a miracle. "That's it, buddy," he murmured, holding out another small piece of chicken. "One step at a time." Max hesitated before taking the second bite, his deep brown eyes flickering with something Mark hadn't seen before: curiosity. Triggers and setbacks. The first time Mark made the mistake of moving too fast, Max panicked. Mark froze. His heart twisted at the sight of Max's body trembling, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. He was panting, his entire frame locked in a desperate bid for survival. "I'm sorry, boy," Mark murmured, lowering himself slowly. "I won't hurt you. You're safe." It took nearly an hour before Max's breathing slowed, before his muscles uncoiled enough to shift out of his defensive position. But he never took his eyes off Mark, watching his every move like a prisoner waiting for the next punishment. That night, Mark sat awake, staring at the ceiling. How do you teach a dog that has only known cruelty that the world isn't out to get him? He didn't have an answer. A new routine. Mark decided to take Max home. Lucy was hesitant, warning him that the dog might not be ready, that the clinic was a controlled environment while Mark's home was full of unpredictable sounds and movements. But Mark knew that if Max was going to heal, he needed something more than just medicine. He needed a home. The drive back was silent. Max lay curled in the passenger seat, ears twitching at every bump in the road. He didn't look at Mark, but he didn't cower either. That was progress. Mark's house was modest, sitting at the edge of town where the land stretched wide and open. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of the trees and the distant hum of passing cars. Max hesitated at the doorstep. Mark didn't pull him inside. He simply stood there, leaving the door open, giving Max the choice. After a long moment, Max stepped in. Mark's house was warm, the fireplace crackling in the living room. He had already prepared a space, a soft bed in the corner, fresh water, a bowl of food. He didn't expect Max to use any of it right away, but he wanted him to know it was there. Max didn't settle. He paced, sniffing every inch of the floor, the furniture, the walls. His body was tense, his tail low but not tucked. Mark let him explore, watching silently from the couch. Eventually, Max found his way to the fireplace. The heat must have felt good against his thin frame, because for the first time since Mark had found him, he lay down on his own. Not because he was too weak to stand, not because he had no other choice, but because he wanted to. Mark exhaled slowly. "Welcome home, Max," he murmured. The dog didn't respond, but as the fire flickered its glow dancing across the room, his body relaxed just a little. And for now, that was enough. The first week at Mark's house was one of cautious progress. Max was eating better, moving with more confidence, and even resting near the fireplace at night instead of hiding in the corner. But something about him still felt fractured. Max rarely barked. He reacted instinctively to sudden sounds. Gunshots on the television made him cower. Heavy footsteps outside sent him pacing. He didn't act like a regular dog. He acted like a survivor, and that gnawed at Mark. He had worked alongside police K9S before. He knew how they moved, how they responded to threats. And there was something in the way Max held himself, alert but silent, always watching, always waiting, that told Mark this dog had been trained. But by whom and for what? Mark knew he needed answers. An unlikely ally. That evening, Mark picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a while. Samantha Hayes was a local investigative journalist, known for exposing corruption and fighting for animal rights. Mark had worked with her on a few cases during his time on the force, and while they didn't always see eye to eye, he respected her instincts. She picked up after the third ring. "Mark Jensen," she said, amusement lacing her tone. "Didn't expect to hear from you. What's the occasion?" "I need your help," Mark said simply. There was a brief pause. "With?" "A dog." Another pause. Then a sigh. "You know, most people call me about politics or illegal businesses, not stray dogs." "This isn't just any dog," Mark replied. "I think he has a past, a bad one." That got her attention. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything." Connecting the dots. The next morning, Samantha arrived at Mark's house, curiosity evident in her sharp green eyes. She was in her late 30s, with auburn hair always tied up in a messy ponytail and a notebook tucked under her arm. As soon as she saw Max, she frowned. "Jesus, Mark, he looks like he's been through a war." "Feels like it too," Mark muttered. Samantha crouched down, watching Max carefully. He was stiff, clearly wary of the new presence in his space. He didn't growl, but his ears flicked back slightly, assessing her. "Has he barked at all?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "Not once." "That's strange. Most dogs, especially strays, either get defensive or try to seek comfort. But he's just observing." Mark crossed his arms. "That's what I've been saying. He's not a normal stray." Samantha leaned closer, eyes narrowing as she examined the faint scars around Max's neck. Suddenly, her gaze snapped back to Mark. "Have you checked if he's chipped?" Mark blinked. He had been so focused on nursing Max back to health that he hadn't even thought about that. Samantha didn't waste time. "We need to take him to the vet." A dark discovery. Lucy greeted them at the clinic with a raised eyebrow. "Back already?" she said, glancing at Max. "Need to check for a microchip," Mark explained. Lucy nodded, leading them to the back room. She ran the scanner down Max's shoulder. For a moment there was nothing. Then, beep. The room fell silent. Lucy checked the screen. As soon as she read the results, her face darkened. This can't be right," she muttered. Mark stepped forward. "What is it?" Lucy turned the screen toward them. Max wasn't just any dog. He had once belonged to a security company linked to underground dogfighting rings. A dog meant for battle. Samantha immediately grabbed her notepad, her brain working at full speed. "This company, what do you know about them?" Lucy frowned. "They claim to provide security-trained dogs, but I've seen their name pop up in cases involving abuse. They take in high-drive breeds like Shepherds, Rottweilers and Malinois, but instead of training them properly, they turn them into weapons." Mark's hands clenched into fists. "So Max was one of them?" Lucy nodded grimly. "Likely. And if they dumped him, it means they didn't see him as useful anymore." Mark looked down at Max, his heart twisting. "They used him. And when he wasn't good enough, they threw him away." Samantha scribbled furiously in her notebook. "This story needs to get out." A town's outrage. Over the next few days, Samantha worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing former employees of the shady company, and even talking to local authorities. When the article was published, "Discarded like trash, the dark side of dog-fighting rings," it spread like wildfire. People were furious. Animal rescue groups got involved. Protests erupted outside the company's headquarters. And most importantly, the police opened an official investigation. Mark watched the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. But amidst all of it, he kept his focus on one thing: Max. Building trust. The night after the article was released, Mark sat on his porch, Max lying beside him. The shepherd had been watching everything, the reporters, the visitors, the growing attention. But for the first time, there was something different in his eyes, a kind of recognition. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was reclaiming his life. Mark reached out, hesitating for a second before scratching behind Max's ears. The dog didn't flinch this time. That was progress. As the cold night air wrapped around them, Mark made a silent promise. Max would never be discarded again. He was home. Mark had seen progress in Max, but he also knew the German shepherd was still far from healed. Physically, the dog had gained weight, his coat no longer dull and patchy, and his movements were steadier, no longer weakened by malnutrition. But mentally, the wounds ran deep. Mark observed the way Max would still freeze when a door slammed or the television volume spiked unexpectedly, how his body stiffened at the sight of strangers, especially men, and how his ears would flatten, his gaze darting for an escape route. Trust was a fragile thing, and for Max, it had been shattered long ago. But Mark wasn't giving up on him. He knew that for Max to truly recover, the shepherd needed to believe, not just in his new home, but in Mark himself. One chilly afternoon, after a long walk in the open fields behind his house, Mark decided it was time for a test. He had been building toward this moment for days, carefully creating an environment where Max felt secure, feeding him by hand to reinforce trust, speaking in soft, steady tones, making sure his movements were predictable. But now, Mark needed to see if Max could move past instinctive fear and respond with something deeper, a bond, a connection, a flicker of loyalty buried beneath the scars of his past. Mark stood in the middle of the backyard, the autumn wind rustling through the trees. He looked down at Max, who sat a few feet away, watching him cautiously. "All right, boy," he murmured, keeping his voice even. "Let's see what you do." Without warning, Mark let out a sharp, exaggerated groan and collapsed to the ground, his body hitting the grass with a heavy thud. Then he went still. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Silence. Max remained motionless, his body tense, his ears perked. Mark could feel the dog's hesitation, the internal battle raging within him. The old Max, the one trained in fear, the one who had been discarded, would have run. But Mark hoped that something had changed, even just a little. His heart pounded as he kept his breathing steady, waiting, listening. Then there was movement, a soft rustle in the grass. Max inched closer, his paws barely making a sound. He sniffed the air cautiously, his instincts warring with his uncertainty. Mark resisted the urge to move, to reassure him. He had to let Max make this decision on his own. Another few seconds passed before Max took the final step forward, standing directly over Mark's body. The shepherd's head lowered, his warm breath ghosting over Mark's face. A pause. Then a soft nudge to the shoulder. Mark barely contained a smile. It wasn't a frantic response, but it was something. An acknowledgement, a question. "Are you okay?" Encouraged, Mark decided to push a little further. He let out a weak cough, shifting slightly as if in pain. Max's entire body tensed, his muscles coiling as if bracing for an attack. But then something remarkable happened. Instead of backing away, Max turned sharply, his body shifting into a protective stance, his ears swiveling to pick up any sounds in the distance. His deep brown eyes scanned the yard, his posture no longer that of a terrified, broken creature, but of a guardian. Mark exhaled slowly, then sat up, careful not to startle Max. "Good boy," he said, voice thick with emotion. Max didn't flinch, didn't recoil. Instead, he held his ground, his gaze locking onto Mark's. For the first time, Mark saw something in those eyes that hadn't been there before. Purpose. Encouraged by the response, Mark reached out a hand, giving Max the choice to accept or retreat. The shepherd hesitated, his body stiff with old memories, old fears. But then, cautiously, he stepped forward and pressed his nose against Mark's palm. It was brief, fleeting, but it was a start. Mark didn't push further. Instead, he stood up slowly, brushing off his jeans. "You did good, Max," he murmured, giving the dog space. Max watched him for a moment, then, as if unsure of what had just happened, he lowered himself onto the grass, tail twitching uncertainly. That night, as Mark sat on the porch with a beer in hand, Max lay nearby, curled into himself. His body was relaxed in a way it hadn't been before, his breathing deep and even. The test had been a success, not because Max had acted out of blind obedience, but because he had chosen to stay, chosen to stand guard, chosen to care. Trust wasn't something that could be forced. It was built, moment by moment, through quiet gestures and unwavering patience. And tonight, Mark knew that for the first time since finding Max on that desolate roadside, the shepherd had taken his first real step toward believing that he was safe. The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the night stretched on, cold and moonlit, casting long shadows across the yard. Mark had fallen asleep on the couch, the soft crackle of the dying fire lulling him into a rare moment of peace. Max lay nearby, his large frame curled on the rug, his breaths deep and even. The past few weeks had been a slow but steady march towards trust, and for the first time, Mark had begun to believe that Max might finally be letting go of his past. Then the silence shattered. A sharp, guttural bark echoed through the house, followed by a deep, rumbling growl that sent shivers down Mark's spine. His eyes snapped open, instincts kicking in before his groggy mind could catch up. Max was already on his feet, his body rigid, ears pricked forward, his gaze locked onto the front door. Something was wrong. Mark sat up, reaching for the handgun he kept in the drawer of the side table. Years on the force had taught him to trust a dog's instincts, and Max wasn't just barking at nothing. The shepherd stood stiffly, every muscle coiled, his tail raised in alert. Mark's gut twisted. There was someone outside. He moved carefully, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor as he approached the window. The porch light flickered dimly, casting a weak glow over the yard. At first he saw nothing, just trees swaying in the wind, the gravel driveway stretching into darkness. But then a shadow moved, a figure, hunched low, creeping along the edge of the house. Mark's grip on his gun tightened, his pulse pounded in his ears. Another figure emerged from the darkness, moving swiftly toward the back door, 2 of them. Max let out another growl, his paws shifting anxiously against the floor. Mark placed a calming hand on his back, though his own heart was racing. Whoever these men were, they weren't here by accident. Taking a deep breath, Mark moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. He cracked it open just enough to step outside, his gun raised, his senses on high alert. The night was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of dry leaves. Then, movement. A sharp glint of metal. Mark barely had time to react before one of the men realized he had been spotted. "Shit!" the intruder cursed, turning on his heel and bolting toward the trees. The second man followed, their dark silhouettes disappearing into the shadows as fast as they had come. Mark cursed under his breath. He could chase them, but without backup it was too risky. Instead, he focused on committing every detail to memory. Their height, their build, the way one of them limped slightly as he ran. But it wasn't until he stepped forward and saw something glinting on the ground that his stomach truly dropped. A chain. A thick, rusted chain, the kind used for restraining large, powerful dogs. And then it hit him. That limp, that build. He had seen one of those men before. Back when he and Samantha had uncovered Max's past, they had come across a name. A handler who had worked with the illegal dogfighting ring. A man who had disappeared when the operation was shut down, never arrested. And now he had shown up here. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Had they come for Max? Behind him, the sound of paws hitting the wooden porch made him turn. Max stood at the threshold of the house, his body a perfect silhouette against the light from inside. His ears were still pricked, his head slightly lowered, his posture no longer that of a fearful, broken animal. He was standing guard. For a long moment, Mark just looked at him. This was the same dog he had found half dead in a ditch, the same dog who had once cowered at the sight of raised hands, and now he was a soldier again. Not for those monsters who had tried to break him, but for Mark. Max let out a low, deliberate growl, his eyes locked onto the darkness where the men had disappeared. He wasn't afraid anymore. Mark tightened his grip on his gun. His blood boiled with quiet rage. They had come once. They would come again, and next time he would be ready. The morning after the break-in, Mark wasted no time. He drove straight to the local police station, Max sitting in the passenger seat, his sharp eyes scanning the road with a quiet intensity. The encounter from the previous night still sat heavy in Mark's chest, a cold reminder that some ghosts never stayed buried. He had recognized that limp, and it was no coincidence that those men had come snooping around his house. Max wasn't just another abandoned dog. They wanted him back. And Mark needed to know why. At the station, Captain Reynolds, an old colleague from Mark's days on the force, leaned back in his chair as he listened to the story. He was a broad-shouldered man with greying hair and a permanent scowl, but as Mark laid out the details, his expression turned darker. When Mark mentioned the chain and the man's limp, Reynolds sat forward, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We've had whispers," Reynolds muttered. "That operation, whatever's left of it, didn't die when we shut it down. The bastard running it, Wallace Grady, is still out there. We assumed he'd gone underground. But if he's sending his men after Max—" He exhaled sharply. "That means the dog knows something. Or rather, they think he does." Mark frowned. Max was just a fighter to them, right? What could he possibly know that's worth tracking him down? Reynolds shook his head. "That's the part I don't like. Maybe he saw something, maybe he was there when something happened. Hell, maybe they're just covering their tracks. But one thing is clear. If they went through the trouble of finding you, they're not going to stop." Mark looked down at Max, who sat at his feet, calm but alert. There was no fear in his posture, no hesitation. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, as if he too knew the war wasn't over. Reynolds met Mark's gaze. "You need to be careful," Mark nodded. "I always am." But in his gut, he knew this was bigger than he had anticipated. Days passed with an eerie sense of normalcy. Mark took Max on their usual walks, kept his gun within reach at all times, and made sure the house was secure before nightfall. But the tension lingered like an unshaken storm. He could feel it, watchful eyes in the distance, an unmarked car parked too long at the end of his street. The past wasn't done with them yet. And then the storm broke. It happened on an unassuming afternoon. Mark had taken Max to the outskirts of town, an open field where the dog could stretch his legs and practice some of the old commands Mark had been working to reinforce. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and for a while it almost felt like things were normal. Then Max stopped. His ears snapped forward, his body stiffening. A low growl rumbled from his throat, and immediately Mark knew. They weren't alone. Before he could react, 3 figures emerged from the tree line, moving fast. Mark reached for his gun, but a 4th man stepped out from behind a truck parked just off the road, leveling a shotgun at him. "Easy now," the man sneered. Mark clenched his jaw. He recognized the face, one of Wallace Grady's men, a known enforcer. His presence alone confirmed Mark's worst fears. "You've got something that belongs to us," the man continued, his grip steady on the shotgun. Mark's pulse pounded, but his voice remained steady. "You mean the dog?" He glanced at Max, who stood at his side, unmoving but coiled like a loaded spring. The man smirked. "Smart. Wallace wants him back." Mark let out a dry chuckle. "Pretty sure you lost any claim to him the moment you left him to die in a ditch." The smirk faded. "This isn't a negotiation." Mark's grip on his weapon tightened. He knew he was outnumbered, knew the odds weren't in his favor. But he also knew something else. They had underestimated Max. There was a fraction of a second where everything was still, where the world held its breath. And then Max moved. Like a ghost of his former self, the German shepherd launched forward with breathtaking precision, his powerful frame closing the distance between him and the man with the shotgun before anyone could react. He went low, his teeth sinking into the man's wrist, forcing the shotgun upward as it discharged into the air. Chaos erupted. Mark took the opening, diving for cover behind the truck as the other men scrambled. Max didn't let up, using every ounce of his training to stay ahead of his attackers. He pivoted, dodged, calculated. One man swung at him with a baton, but Max ducked and latched onto his arm, bringing him to the ground with a guttural snarl. Mark popped up from his cover, firing off 2 warning shots that sent the remaining 2 men ducking. The moment of confusion was all Max needed. He turned sharply, releasing his grip just long enough to maneuver behind Mark, standing guard, teeth bared, his deep growl vibrating through the air. It was over in minutes. A distant sound of sirens cut through the aftermath, growing louder. Mark exhaled, heart still pounding. Reynolds had come through. The remaining men, realizing they were outmatched, made a last-ditch attempt to flee, but police cars roared into view, blocking the only escape route. Officers poured out, guns raised, shouting commands that left no room for argument. One by one, Wallace Grady's men were forced to the ground, handcuffed and hauled to their feet. Mark finally allowed himself to breathe. He looked down at Max, who was watching the officers warily, but standing tall. His body still trembled with adrenaline, but there was something else in his stance, something that hadn't been there before. Confidence. Reynolds approached, shaking his head. "Hell of a mess you got yourself into." Mark snorted. "You're welcome." Reynolds looked at Max. "And him?" Mark reached down, running a hand over the shepherd's back. Max leaned into the touch, just slightly. "He's not just some abandoned dog," Mark said quietly. "He never was." Reynolds studied Max for a long moment before nodding. "You're lucky to have him." Mark smiled. "No, I think we're lucky to have each other." As the officers loaded the criminals into squad cars, Mark knelt beside Max. The dog looked at him, ears perked, waiting. "You did good, boy," Mark murmured. Max didn't respond in words. He didn't need to. Instead, he pressed his head against Mark's shoulder, just for a moment, before turning his gaze back to the world. He wasn't running anymore. He was home. The dust had settled. Wallace Grady and his men were behind bars, and the dark shadow of Max's past had finally lifted. For the first time in a long time, there were no threats lurking in the corners, no footsteps creeping in the night, no reason to keep the gun within arm's reach at all times. Mark felt the weight that had been pressing on his chest finally ease. Max had found his place, not just as a survivor, but as something more, a protector, a fighter, a friend. But as the days passed, a new question emerged. What came next? The morning after the final confrontation, Mark sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the hills. Max was lying at his feet, his body relaxed, his gaze following the birds that flitted through the trees. It was a stark contrast to the dog Mark had first carried into Lucy's clinic, a trembling, wounded soul barely clinging to life. Now Max looked whole. He still had scars, of course, both the ones visible on his body and the ones hidden deep in his mind. But there was a light in his eyes now, a quiet strength that had not been there before. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. The sound of a car approaching pulled Mark from his thoughts. He turned to see Captain Reynolds stepping out of a cruiser, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Mark," Reynolds said, closing the door behind him. "Morning," Mark replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Didn't expect to see you here." Reynolds nodded toward Max, who had risen to his feet, ears pricked in curiosity. "Came to talk about him." Mark stiffened slightly, but didn't say anything. Reynolds continued. "The department wants to take him in. With his past training, he'd make an excellent addition to a K9 unit. He's sharp, disciplined. Hell, after what he pulled the other night, I'd say he's already got more field experience than half our rookies." Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw. He had expected this, but hearing the words out loud still sent an uneasy feeling through his chest. "He's not a tool," Mark said finally. Reynolds sighed. "You know that's not what I'm saying. But Max is special, and we could use a dog like him. He'd have a purpose." Mark looked at Max. The shepherd was watching him, eyes steady, tail twitching slightly. There was no fear in his stance, no hesitation, just quiet understanding, as if he too knew what was being discussed. "He already has a purpose," Mark said. Reynolds studied him. "And what's that?" Mark set his coffee down and ran a hand over Max's head, feeling the warmth of his thick fur. "I've been thinking a lot about that," he admitted. "Max didn't just survive. He fought, he adapted, and he learned to trust again. That's not something you can teach a dog. It's something they have to find in themselves." Reynolds nodded. "And?" Mark took a deep breath. "I want to train him to be a PTSD service dog for veterans." Reynolds blinked, clearly surprised. "That's not what I expected." Mark shrugged. "It makes sense, doesn't it? Max knows what it's like to be hurt, to be afraid, to feel lost. He's come out on the other side of it, and if he can help someone else do the same, then that's where he belongs." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, before he finally let out a low chuckle. "You always were a stubborn bastard." Mark smirked. Takes one to know one. Reynolds shook his head but extended a hand. All right, Jensen, he's yours. Mark took the handshake, relief washing over him. He had made his choice, and he knew it was the right one. The next few weeks were spent learning everything there was to know about PTSD service dogs. Mark reached out to a local veterans organization, the Guardian Paws program, which specialized in training dogs to assist former soldiers struggling with trauma. He attended workshops, read manuals, and even consulted with professional trainers. And Max? He thrived. The same discipline that had been forced into him in his past life was now being repurposed into something far more meaningful. He learned to recognize the signs of anxiety, tapping feet, clenched fists, shallow breathing. He learned to provide grounding techniques, nudging his head against Mark's palm when he sensed tension. And most importantly, he learned to be a steady, unshakable presence, a reminder that no one had to fight their battles alone. Mark worked with him every day, guiding him through the process, reinforcing positive behavior with gentle praise and rewards. The bond between them deepened, no longer one of necessity, but of genuine partnership. One afternoon, Lucy stopped by the house, leaning against the porch railing as she watched Max go through his training exercises. I have to admit, she said, arms crossed. I wasn't sure what you were doing at first, but it suits him. Mark nodded. Yeah, it does. Lucy smiled, then looked at him knowingly. And it suits you too, doesn't it? Mark paused, then let out a breathy chuckle. Maybe. She didn't press him further. She didn't need to. The real test came when Mark brought Max to a local veterans support group. The room was filled with men and women, some in wheelchairs, some with visible scars, others with wounds that couldn't be seen but were just as deep. Max walked in calmly, his ears pricked, his tail wagging slightly in a way that wasn't overly excited, just comforting. Mark watched as Max approached a man sitting alone, his hands fidgeting, his knee bouncing. The man barely acknowledged anyone else in the room, his eyes distant. But when Max stopped in front of him and nudged his hand, the man hesitated, then slowly let his fingers graze the shepherd's fur. The bouncing knee stilled. The fingers stopped fidgeting. And then, quietly, almost too soft to hear, the man whispered, "Good boy." Mark felt something tighten in his chest. Max had found his purpose, and maybe, just maybe, so had he. That night, as Mark sat on his porch with Max lying beside him, he watched the stars flicker above. The road that had brought them here had been long, painful, and uncertain, but they had made it, together. "You did good, buddy," Mark murmured, running a hand through Max's fur. Max let out a soft sigh, his body stretching against the wooden planks, utterly at peace. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt it too. A year had passed, and the town had changed in quiet but profound ways. The seasons had turned, shifting from the harsh cold of winter to the gentle warmth of spring. The trees that once stood barren were now full of life, their branches swaying with fresh green leaves. The fields stretched wide and golden under the morning sun, the scent of blooming wildflowers drifting in the breeze. It was a new season, a fresh start, and for Max, it was something more. The German shepherd was no longer the skeletal, trembling creature Mark had found on the side of the road. His coat gleamed under the sunlight, thick and healthy, the deep tan and black fur a stark contrast to the pale scars that still lingered on his body. His frame, once weak and frail, now held strength and agility, muscles rippling beneath his coat as he ran across the yard, his paws barely touching the earth before springing forward again. He was fast, lightning quick, his movements fluid and effortless, his ears pricked and his eyes bright with joy. Mark leaned against the porch railing, watching as Max chased a fluttering butterfly, his tail wagging in wide, enthusiastic arcs. It was a sight that never failed to bring a smile to his face. This was a dog that had once been abandoned, discarded like trash. And now he was a symbol of hope. The town had embraced Max in ways Mark never expected. After news spread about the takedown of Wallace Grady's operation, Max had become something of a local hero. People recognized him when Mark took him for walks through town. Children ran up to pet him. Veterans reached out with quiet gratitude, knowing that Max understood their struggles in ways words never could. At the Guardian Paws program, Max had helped more veterans than Mark could count. He had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was struggling, his presence grounding them, his gentle nudges pulling them from the depths of memories they wished they could escape. He would sit beside those who couldn't speak, let them run their fingers through his fur until their breathing slowed, until the tension in their shoulders eased. He never demanded attention, never forced himself into their space. He simply waited, offering silent companionship in a way that only those who had known true suffering could. Mark had seen it happen over and over again. One day, a soldier who had barely spoken since returning from deployment sat in a chair, staring blankly ahead, lost in a place no one could reach. Max walked up to him, pressing his head against the man's knee. The man blinked, his hand twitching slightly, but he didn't pull away. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his fingers curled into Max's fur. And then, after a long pause, he whispered, "Good dog." Mark had to swallow the lump in his throat. Moments like those were why he knew he had made the right choice. Max had saved lives, not in the way he had been forced to in his past life, but in a way that mattered. He had given people a reason to keep going, a reminder that they weren't alone. And Max himself? He was happy. As if sensing Mark's thoughts, Max turned away from his butterfly chase and trotted toward the porch, his tongue hanging lazily out of his mouth. He climbed the steps and sat beside Mark, his body warm against the wood, his head tilting up as if waiting for something. Mark chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "What? You want me to say it?" Max's tail thumped. Mark smirked, shaking his head. "Fine, you did good, buddy." Max let out a satisfied huff, then flopped onto his side, stretching out in the sun. The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching against the gravel driveway. Mark looked up to see Samantha Hayes stepping out of her car, her ever-present notepad tucked under one arm. She had been one of the first to tell Max's story, and even after the news cycle had moved on, she had remained a friend. She approached the porch, waving. "Still training heroes, huh?" Mark smirked. "He does most of the work." Samantha knelt beside Max, ruffling his fur. "You're famous, you know that? The program's been getting calls from all over, people asking about Max, about the veterans he's helped. You guys are making a difference." Mark leaned back against the railing. "He is." Samantha smiled, then reached into her bag and pulled out a newspaper, handing it to him. "Figured you might want a copy of this." Mark unfolded it, his eyes skimming the front page. There, printed in bold letters, was the headline, "From Fighter to Healer, the unbelievable journey of Max, the dog who refused to give up." A photograph of Max sat just below it, not the broken, battered dog from a year ago, but the strong, confident shepherd he had become. Mark let out a slow breath, staring at the image. It felt surreal. Samantha stood, dusting off her jeans. "Thought you'd like to have something to remember this by." Mark folded the paper carefully, glancing at Max, who had begun lazily chewing on a stick. "I don't think I'll ever forget." She smiled, then gestured toward her car. "I've got to run, but I'll check in soon." Mark watched as she left, then looked down at the newspaper again. It was strange seeing Max's journey laid out in ink, knowing how far they had come. He thought back to that cold winter morning when he had found Max in the ditch, skin and bones, barely breathing, abandoned like nothing more than trash. He had almost driven past him. Almost, but something had stopped him. Something deep in his gut had told him that he had to stop, that he couldn't leave this dog behind. And now, a year later, he realized the truth. Max hadn't just needed saving. Mark had needed him just as much. The sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Max, sensing the quiet shift in the atmosphere, sat up and nudged Mark's hand. Mark smiled. "Come on, let's go inside." Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging. He was no longer a victim, no longer a prisoner of his past. He was free. And Mark knew without a doubt that their meeting on that road had never been chance. It had been fate. If Max's story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that changed a life, human or animal? Share your thoughts and experiences below. And if you believe in second chances, don't forget to spread this story so others can be inspired too.
Darkness cloaked the forest, with only the whisper of rustling leaves and the biting wind weaving through the trees. Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, suddenly let out a low growl, ears pricked, eyes locked on something unseen. Evelyn Parker stepped onto her porch, a chill creeping down her spine. She had no idea that just a few steps away, her life was about to change forever. A cardboard box sat abandoned in the depths of the forest, and as Evelyn cautiously lifted the lid, she couldn't believe her eyes. What had she just uncovered? What secrets lay hidden in the shadows of the trees? The wind howled through the towering pines, sending a shiver down Evelyn Parker's spine. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, glancing at the old clock above the fireplace. 11:47 p.m. The night was colder than usual, signaling the early arrival of winter. Outside, the dense Appalachian forest stood like an impenetrable wall, its darkness swallowing even the faintest moonlight. Ranger, her loyal German shepherd, lay curled at the foot of the couch, his thick fur rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He was always by her side, her only true companion since she moved to this isolated farmhouse. Just as she reached for the oil lamp to dim the lights, Ranger's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he let out a low, guttural growl. His muscles tensed, and within seconds, he was on his feet, pacing toward the door. Evelyn frowned. Ranger was well trained, not one to react without reason. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, standing from her chair. Ranger didn't break his focus. His amber eyes burned with intensity as he growled again, louder this time. Then he darted toward the wooden door, barking sharply. Evelyn's heart pounded. She had lived here long enough to know the usual noises of the forest. Owls, the distant cry of a coyote, even the occasional bear rummaging through the underbrush. But this was different. A deep, unshakable instinct told her something was wrong. Sighing, she reached for the shotgun mounted near the entrance, not because she planned to use it, but because it gave her a sense of security. Slipping on her boots, she hesitated for a moment before turning the knob. The old wooden door creaked open, revealing the crisp, bone-chilling air outside. The night was unnervingly quiet. Ranger rushed ahead, his nose to the ground, his tail held stiff. His breath came in quick puffs, white mist curling in the cold air. "Ranger," Evelyn called, stepping onto the porch. "What is it, boy?" He didn't respond. Instead, he bolted toward the tree line, his paws kicking up frost-covered leaves. Evelyn hesitated. A part of her wanted to turn back, to lock the door, and wait for morning. But another part, a part buried deep within her, the part that had always trusted Ranger without question, forced her to move forward. Gripping the lantern tightly, she followed her dog into the darkness. The box in the woods. The further she walked, the more unnatural the silence became. The usual rustling of nocturnal creatures was absent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ranger led her down a familiar path toward the edge of her property, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows deeper. Then she saw it. A small cardboard box, partially covered by damp leaves, sat in the middle of the clearing. Evelyn's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the lantern, its flickering light casting eerie shadows around the forest floor. Why would someone leave a box in the middle of nowhere? Ranger circled it cautiously, his tail stiff, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. He let out a soft whine, then pawed at the ground near it. Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she crouched beside the box, her fingers trembling as she reached for the damp cardboard. The moment she lifted the lid, her world tilted. Inside, wrapped in thin blankets, was a baby, a newborn. Its tiny body trembled violently against the cold, its face red and scrunched up, as if it had been crying for hours. But now, it was silent. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Who would abandon a child here? Her fingers instinctively reached out, brushing against the infant's icy skin. Too cold. The baby was barely conscious, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ranger whined again, nudging her arm as if urging her to hurry. Evelyn didn't think. She acted. Scooping the fragile bundle into her arms, she cradled the baby against her chest, shielding it from the biting wind. She stood abruptly, heart racing, and turned back toward the farmhouse. She needed to get this baby warm. Now, an unsettling presence. By the time Evelyn burst through the front door, she was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer shock of what had just happened. She moved swiftly, placing the baby on the couch by the fireplace, wrapping it in thicker, warmer blankets. She stoked the fire, turning up the heat in the small farmhouse. Ranger paced near the door, ears still pricked, tail low. He wasn't at ease. Evelyn sat beside the baby, gently rubbing its tiny hands, hoping to bring warmth back into its fragile body. Then, a soft whimper. The child stirred slightly, its lips parting in a weak, gasping breath. Evelyn let out a relieved sigh. The baby was alive, still cold, still frail, but alive. But the tension in the room wasn't gone. Ranger was still on edge. He remained near the door, body tense, his head snapping toward the window. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Evelyn's stomach twisted. He could sense something. She slowly turned toward the window, her pulse quickening. Through the frost-lined glass, the forest loomed in eerie stillness. She saw nothing, but she felt it. A presence. Something, or someone, was out there, watching. A sharp bark from Ranger made her jump. Evelyn moved to the door, checking the lock, peering through the peephole. Still, nothing. Just the endless, shadowy woods. Her fingers lingered on the latch. Should she call someone? Sheriff Carter, maybe? She shook her head. It was late. She was probably imagining things. The night, the cold, the stress. It was all getting to her. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to the baby. It had finally settled, its breathing steady, its tiny fingers curled against the warm fabric of the blanket. Evelyn sat down beside the couch, running a hand through her hair, exhaling deeply. She wasn't ready for this. She hadn't planned for this. And yet, as she looked down at the fragile child resting in her home, she knew. There was no turning back. Something had brought this baby to her, and whatever was out there in the woods that night was not done yet. Ranger let out another low growl. The forest, still and quiet, seemed to whisper in response. The morning light seeped through the thick fog that clung to the forest like a ghostly veil. Evelyn Parker barely slept. The baby, now wrapped in the warmest blanket she could find, had spent the night in a peaceful, albeit fragile, sleep. But Evelyn's mind remained restless. Who had left the child out there, and why? More importantly, was someone coming back for them? Ranger had spent the night in a state of constant alert. Every few hours, he'd pace near the door, sniffing the air, ears twitching toward the window. Something still unsettled him, and that was enough to keep Evelyn on edge. By dawn, she had made up her mind. She needed help. Sheriff Daniel Carter arrives. An hour later, a familiar patrol truck rumbled up her dirt driveway, dust swirling behind its tires. Sheriff Daniel Carter stepped out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the property. A man of few words but sharp instincts, he had known Evelyn for years, ever since she moved here after her husband passed. He wasn't just a sheriff, he was a friend. His sharp hazel eyes scanned her face, reading the exhaustion there before she even spoke. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, pulling off his leather gloves. "I might have," Evelyn admitted, leading him inside. The moment Carter laid eyes on the baby nestled on the couch, his expression hardened. "You found them in the woods?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "Last night. If it wasn't for Ranger, I never would have seen the box." Carter crouched down, carefully inspecting the infant's tiny features. No signs of injury, just cold. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his chin. "This doesn't make sense. No reports of a missing child, no abandoned vehicles in the area. It's like they just appeared." Evelyn folded her arms. "That's what worries me." Carter stood, adjusting his hat. "We need to go back out there, see if we missed anything." Ranger let out a sharp bark, as if agreeing. A new discovery in the forest. The autumn air was crisp as Evelyn, Carter, and Ranger made their way back into the woods. The leaves crunched beneath their boots, and the silence from the night before still lingered. Evelyn led them to the clearing where she had found the box. It was still there, damp from the morning dew, a ghostly reminder of the mystery that had unfolded just hours before. Carter knelt, inspecting the ground. No footprints. Whoever left them here knew how to cover their tracks. Evelyn shivered. The idea that someone had done this deliberately, calculated, careful, made her uneasy. Then Ranger stiffened. The German shepherd's nose twitched, ears pressing forward. He sniffed the air, growled softly, then took off deeper into the trees. "Ranger!" Evelyn called, but he wasn't stopping. He had found something. She and Carter exchanged glances before taking off after the dog. The wild child. They followed Ranger down a narrow, overgrown path. The forest here felt different, darker, older. The air itself seemed heavier. Then they saw her. A small figure, barely more than a shadow, crouched in the underbrush, partially hidden by tangled vines. A child. A girl no older than 7 or 8. Her blonde hair was wild and unkempt, falling over her thin, dirt-smeared face. Her blue-gray eyes were wide, darting between them in pure animalistic fear. She was barefoot, her thin dress torn and tattered, her arms scratched from branches and thorns. She looked like she had been out here for days, maybe longer. The moment Evelyn took a step forward, the child bared her teeth, snarling. A low, guttural sound, not unlike a feral animal. Evelyn froze. Carter's hand moved toward his belt, but she held up a warning hand. "Wait." Ranger, however, did not growl. He whined softly, taking a slow step forward, lowering his head in a gesture of trust. The girl's eyes locked onto him. Seconds stretched painfully. Then, something shifted. The girl relaxed just slightly, her tense shoulders dropping. Evelyn took a slow breath, crouching to the girl's level. "Hey there," she said gently. "It's okay. We won't hurt you." The girl didn't move. Her wide, unblinking eyes flickered toward the trees, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. "We can't leave her out here," Carter muttered under his breath. Evelyn nodded. "But we can't force her either." She turned back to the girl. "You're cold," Evelyn said, voice soft. "Hungry too, I bet." Slowly, carefully, she pulled off her flannel jacket and set it down on the ground in front of the child. She didn't push, didn't force, just waited. The girl stared at the jacket for a long moment. Then, like a frightened doe, she reached out, snatching it before retreating into herself again. It was progress. Evelyn dared another step closer, but the girl flinched, clutching the jacket to her chest. Then, a sharp snap from deep in the forest. The girl's eyes widened. She bolted. A desperate chase. "Wait!" Evelyn lunged forward. The child sprinted through the trees with unnatural speed, dodging branches and leaping over roots like she belonged to the forest itself. Ranger took off after her, barking and warning. "Damn it!" Carter cursed. "Come on!" The three of them chased the girl through the woods. She was fast, but not faster than Ranger. The German shepherd cut her off in a clearing, standing firm in her path, forcing her to stop. The child skidded to a halt, panting. For a moment, she looked at the dog, truly looked. Then, for the first time, her expression softened. Ranger took a step forward and nudged her hand. Evelyn and Carter approached slowly. "You're safe now," Evelyn whispered. The girl didn't speak, but after a long, tense silence, she let Evelyn take her hand. A new name. Back at the farmhouse, Evelyn guided the girl inside. The child hesitated at the threshold, her body stiff. But Ranger stepped in first, turning to look at her, his silent invitation. She followed. Evelyn placed a plate of food in front of the child. She ate like she hadn't seen food in days. Carter sat back, rubbing his temples. "We need to call social services." Evelyn hesitated. Something told her that this child didn't belong in the system. Not yet. For now, she needed kindness, stability, and a name. Evelyn looked at the girl, who had curled up on the couch beside Ranger, her small hands gripping his fur like an anchor. "Luna," Evelyn said softly. The child lifted her head. "Your name is Luna." For the first time, her lips parted, as if she recognized it. And in that moment, Evelyn knew. Luna's story was just beginning. The farmhouse had been unusually quiet since Luna's arrival. The child, though still skittish, had slowly begun to adjust. She no longer flinched at every movement or shrank away when Evelyn approached, but she still refused to speak. Instead, she drew. Evelyn first noticed it that morning. Luna had taken a small piece of charcoal from the fireplace and, without hesitation, began sketching symbols on the wooden floor of the living room. At first, Evelyn thought it was just a child scribbling, but as she looked closer, she felt a chill creep up her spine. The symbols were familiar. The markings from the past. Evelyn crouched beside Luna, studying the shapes forming beneath the child's small hands. Some of them resembled ancient sigils she had seen before, hidden away in her grandmother's old books, in the dusty journals tucked away in the attic. Crescent moons, spirals, pathways weaving into one another, the same symbols that her grandmother had once called the guardian's markings. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Luna," she said softly, "where did you learn this?" The child didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She just kept drawing. Ranger sat beside her, watching intently. His ears flicked toward the door every few minutes, as if expecting something, or someone, to arrive. Evelyn's unease grew. That was when she heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. A stranger at the door. A firm knock echoed through the farmhouse. Evelyn's heart jumped. She wasn't expecting visitors. Out here, people rarely came without calling first. With one last glance at Luna, who was still lost in her drawings, Evelyn rose and opened the door. A woman stood before her. She was tall, her long, silver-streaked hair cascading over a heavy brown coat. Her green eyes were sharp, calculating, but not unkind. There was something about her presence that felt both familiar and unsettling. "You don't know me," the woman said, her voice calm but urgent. "But I know who you are, Evelyn Parker." Evelyn's grip on the door tightened. "And you are—" "Sarah Monroe." The woman glanced past her, into the house. "I need to talk to you. Now." Evelyn hesitated. Something about the way this woman held herself, the way she spoke with quiet authority. It told Evelyn that she wasn't here by accident. She stepped aside. "Come in." A chilling revelation. Inside, Sarah's gaze immediately locked onto Luna, who had paused in her drawing, staring back at the stranger with wary recognition. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was right," she murmured. "Right about what?" Evelyn asked. Sarah turned to face her, her expression serious. "Those children, the baby you found, this girl, they are not isolated cases. This is only the beginning." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah gestured toward the symbols on the floor. "These aren't just drawings, Evelyn. They're maps, warnings. You've seen these symbols before, haven't you?" Evelyn hesitated. I think so," she admitted. "In some of my grandmother's old books." Sarah nodded. "Because your family has been involved in this far longer than you realize." Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "My grandmother never spoke about anything like this." "She wouldn't have," Sarah said. "Not openly, but I promise you, she knew. Your family has always been the keepers of the forest." Evelyn let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Keepers of the forest? You make it sound like some kind of myth." "It's not a myth." Sarah reached into her coat, pulling out a worn leather journal. She opened it to a page filled with handwritten notes and sketches of the same symbols Luna had drawn. Evelyn's breath hitched. Sarah looked at her. "The paths are opening, Evelyn, just like they have in the past. And when they open, children appear, lost, alone, seeking shelter." Evelyn swallowed hard. "And when the paths open," Sarah continued, lowering her voice, "others come looking for them." Evelyn's skin prickled. "You're saying someone is after these kids?" Sarah nodded grimly. "Yes, and they won't stop until they find them." A hidden legacy. Evelyn sank into the nearest chair, her mind spinning. "Why my family?" she murmured. "Why is this happening now?" Sarah closed the journal. "Your great-great-grandmother was the first recorded guardian of these paths," she said. "She was chosen to protect them, not by law, not by force, but by the paths themselves." Evelyn's head snapped up. "What does that even mean?" Sarah sighed. The forest isn't just trees and dirt, Evelyn. It's alive. It has rules. It has a will of its own. The paths open for those in need. They close for those who seek to exploit them. And certain people, certain families, are meant to watch over them. Yours is one of those families. Evelyn shook her head. This is insane. Is it? Sarah challenged. A baby abandoned in the woods with no explanation? A wild child who knows ancient symbols without ever being taught? A dog that seems to understand more than any animal should? Evelyn's eyes flickered toward Ranger. The German shepherd was watching Sarah intently. She exhaled shakily. Let's say I believe you. What now? What am I supposed to do? Sarah's expression darkened. You need to be ready, she said. Because if these children found their way to you, that means the others, the ones looking to control these paths, are coming next. Evelyn shivered. The farmhouse suddenly felt much smaller. The night grows cold. After Sarah left, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the house was being watched. Luna had curled up near the fire with Ranger, but Evelyn noticed something unsettling. The child wasn't asleep. She was staring at the front door, waiting. For what? Evelyn didn't know. But something told her, whatever Sarah was warning her about, had already begun. The air around Mill Creek had shifted. Evelyn could feel it in her bones, the way the wind carried an unnatural stillness, the way Ranger's ears twitched at unseen movements, the way Luna stayed close to the farmhouse, her wide eyes darting toward the tree line whenever night fell. The warning had been given. Now the storm was coming. A powerful man with dangerous ambitions. Sheriff Daniel Carter had always known Nate Richards was trouble. The man came from old money, one of the wealthiest families in town. The Richards family had their hands in land deals, politics, and anything that promised power. But lately, Nate had been asking too many questions about the forest. Over the past week, Carter had overheard conversations in town, hushed whispers between business owners, worried murmurs at the local diner. Nate was making moves, and Evelyn's land was at the center of it. That morning, Carter drove to City Hall to dig into the records. He needed to confirm his suspicions. After an hour of flipping through dusty legal files, his blood ran cold. Nate Richards had filed a request to claim ownership over sections of the forest, Evelyn's property included. The request was based on an old territorial law, one that suggested certain lands could be seized if they contained unregistered historical significance. Carter slammed the file shut. Historical significance? Nate wasn't interested in preservation. He was after something much bigger. A secret worth hiding. That evening, Carter pulled up to Evelyn's farmhouse, his patrol lights flickering briefly before shutting off. Evelyn answered the door immediately, a frown on her face. You look like hell, Dan. He stepped inside, glancing around. Luna sat quietly by the fire, her fingers idly tracing symbols on the wooden floor. Carter exhaled. More symbols. He turned to Evelyn. We have a problem. He tossed the file onto her kitchen table. She flipped through it, her brow furrowing. Her land, the paths, the sudden legal maneuvering. Evelyn's stomach twisted. You think Nate knows about the paths? Carter nodded grimly. He knows something is out there, and he's convinced it's valuable. Whether he thinks it's gold, land rights, or some ancient secret, I don't know. But he's not playing fair. Evelyn swallowed hard. So, what do we do? Carter's voice hardened. We watch our backs. The strangers in the night. Later that evening, Ranger started pacing. Evelyn had seen this behavior before, the same alertness he had when they first found the baby in the woods. The hairs on his back stood up, his ears twitched, his nose flared. Something was out there. Evelyn grabbed her rifle from behind the door. Carter, who had stayed to keep watch, did the same. They stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The air felt thick, heavy. Then, movement. A flicker of shadow between the trees. Evelyn's grip tightened. Dan, I see it. Carter pulled out his flashlight, aiming it toward the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. Then, a second shadow, then another. There were multiple figures moving through the trees. Carter clenched his jaw. This isn't just some drunk hunters wandering too close. They're scoping the place. Evelyn's heart pounded. Suddenly, Ranger growled, low and threatening. Then came the snap of a twig, much closer this time. Someone was near the fence line. The attempted break-in. Later that night, Evelyn locked every door and window. Carter stationed himself by the front door, his hand resting on his gun. Luna refused to sleep. She sat on the floor, drawing again. But this time, her movements were urgent, almost frantic. She was creating a pattern, a circular formation of symbols larger than before. Evelyn knelt beside her. "Luna, what are you drawing?" The girl's breathing was quick. Then, a noise. The sound of metal shifting, the back door handle. Someone was trying to open it. Bang! Ranger launched forward, barking viciously. Evelyn and Carter sprinted toward the kitchen. The back door rattled violently. Someone was trying to force it open. Carter moved fast, unlocking the safety on his gun. "Show yourself!" he barked. But the moment he spoke, the rattling stopped. Then, silence. Carter yanked the door open, stepping onto the porch. His gun was raised, eyes scanning the darkness. But whoever had been there was gone. Ranger snarled at the night, his fur bristling. Something had been watching them. A dark warning. They searched the property, but the intruder had vanished. Still, they had left a message. At the edge of the fence line, a marking had been scratched into the dirt. Evelyn's stomach twisted. One of Luna's symbols, except this one was drawn backward, distorted. Carter exhaled sharply. "This was a warning," he muttered. "They know we're watching." Evelyn clutched her rifle tighter. For the first time, she realized. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the paths, the children. And now, whoever wanted them knew exactly where to look. The forest was alive with whispers. Leaves rustled without wind. Branches swayed as if recoiling from unseen presences. And Evelyn could feel it, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Sarah had insisted they go deeper into the woods. "There's something we're missing," she had said. Now, as they followed Luna's silent steps, Evelyn had a sinking feeling that whatever they were searching for was also searching for them. A hidden refuge. Ranger's ears flicked forward. Then he stopped. His nose flared, sniffing the air. His muscles tensed. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, weaving through the underbrush, his paws barely making a sound. "Ranger, wait!" Evelyn called. But the German shepherd was focused. He led them down a steep incline, deeper into a part of the woods Evelyn had never explored. Then they saw it, a rock formation, half hidden behind layers of thick vines and moss. Sarah's breath caught. A cave! Carter narrowed his eyes. It's been deliberately hidden. Evelyn's fingers brushed the vines aside and froze. There, etched into the stone, was another one of the symbols, the same ones Luna had drawn. Luna stepped forward, her small fingers tracing the markings with a familiarity that made Evelyn's skin prickle. She knew this place. Echoes of the past. Inside the cave, the air was thick with the smell of damp stone and time itself. The deeper they went, the more they saw. Remnants of old blankets, faint footprints in the dirt, dried herbs tied in careful bundles. Someone had lived here, not long ago. Sarah touched the cave wall, where more symbols had been carved into the stone. "They've been using this place as a sanctuary," she murmured. Carter ran a hand over one of the carvings. "They?" Sarah's voice was grim. "The lost children." Evelyn swallowed hard. The ones who disappeared without explanation. The ones who found their way through the paths. And suddenly, everything felt too quiet. Ranger growled. A crack of a branch echoed outside the cave. Then, footsteps. Someone was coming. The hunters arrive. Carter moved first. He pulled his gun, motioning for everyone to stay back. Evelyn pressed Luna to her chest, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. A voice drifted through the trees. "Find them!" Evelyn stiffened. Nate Richards. His men were close, too close. Sarah grabbed her wrist. "We have to move, now!" Carter gestured for them to retreat deeper into the cave, but Luna did something unexpected. She shook her head. Then, without a word, she darted toward the other exit. "Luna, wait!" But Ranger followed, and Evelyn knew Luna wasn't running. She was leading. A path only she could see. Luna ran through the undergrowth without hesitation. her small frame moving like she had memorized the forest itself. Sarah was the first to realize it. She knows where she's going. Evelyn didn't question it. She followed, Carter close behind. The sounds of pursuing footsteps grew louder. Branches snapped, voices cursed. They went this way. But no matter how fast the men moved, Luna was faster. She ducked between narrow openings in the trees, slipping through hidden pathways no adult could follow. Evelyn didn't understand how, but the paths were shifting for Luna. One moment, the land was impassable. The next, a clear opening. She wasn't just running, she was choosing the way. The final stretch. They reached a clearing. The moonlight spilled through the trees, revealing an old wooden footbridge, one that Evelyn had never seen before. Luna didn't hesitate. She ran across. But just as Evelyn and the others reached the edge, the bridge began to change. Wooden planks, sturdy just moments before, began to creak and splinter, as if the forest itself was shifting against their pursuers. Nate's men reached the tree line. They saw the bridge, but something stopped them. Evelyn looked back. The forest had swallowed the path behind them, like it had never been there. The men hesitated. "Sir, I don't think we should—" But before they could step forward, a sound rumbled through the trees. A deep primal growl. Not Ranger, something else, something watching from the darkness. And that was enough. Nate's men didn't take another step. They turned back. The forest's protection. Evelyn collapsed onto the ground, gasping. Ranger sat beside her, his chest heaving. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. Carter watched the path disappear, his grip on his gun finally relaxing. "I don't think they'll be following us anymore." Evelyn looked at Luna. The child was completely calm, like she had always known this would happen. Evelyn's hands trembled. "What was that?" Sarah smiled faintly. "That," she whispered, "was the forest choosing sides." And Evelyn realized they weren't running from the forest. They were being protected by it. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The time for running had ended. Back at the farmhouse, Evelyn paced the kitchen, the weight of everything pressing on her chest. She had spent years avoiding the past, pretending the stories about her family were just that, stories. But now, the past was knocking at her door, demanding to be faced. Carter leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Are you sure about this?" Evelyn met his gaze. "We're going to stop Nate Richards, tonight." Gathering the evidence. Carter had spent the last 24 hours pulling every file, record, and testimony he could find. Nate Richards had been bribing town officials, making backdoor deals, and forcing people off their land for years. But this time, he had overstepped. Trying to claim the forest itself, that was a mistake. Sarah, meanwhile, had been working in the woods. Using chalk and herbs, she sealed off several of the hidden pathways, making sure that Nate's men couldn't access them. "This will only hold for a while," she warned, "but we need to buy time." Ranger sat by the door, ears twitching, his eyes locked on the tree line. Even he could sense it. Something was coming. The town council meeting. That evening, Evelyn walked into Mill Creek's town hall with Carter by her side. Sarah and Luna followed close behind. The room was packed. Nate Richards stood at the center, his signature smug smile in place as he handed a thick file to the council. "These documents," he declared, "prove that the Parker family's claim to that land is invalid. According to these records, my ancestors had a rightful stake in that forest." Evelyn's fists clenched. He was lying. The documents were forged. Carter stepped forward, dropping his own stack of papers onto the table. "That's funny," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "because these documents show something else." One by one, he laid out the evidence. Bribed officials, forged documents, illegal land grabs. The council members began whispering. Nate's smirk faded. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You have no proof that I—" He stopped, because Luna had moved. She stepped forward, her small fingers reaching for the council's table. Without a word, she picked up a piece of chalk and began drawing. "The forest answers." Evelyn's breath caught. The symbol Luna was drawing, it was the same one from the cave, the same one from the trees, the same one Sarah had sealed the paths with. The moment Luna finished the last stroke, a shockwave rippled through the air. The lights inside Town Hall flickered. And outside, the forest responded. A deep, low hum filled the air. Through the windows, they saw it. The trees began to glow. Golden lines of light traced through the bark, spreading like veins, illuminating the hidden paths. Gasps filled the room. One council member stood, his voice shaking. What is that?" Sarah's voice was calm. "The paths are speaking." Nate's face twisted with rage. "This is some trick!" But it wasn't. The forest had made its choice, and it wasn't with him. A power beyond control. Nate lunged toward the council. "You can't seriously believe this nonsense. The land is mine." But he never made it. Ranger growled, stepping between him and Luna, his teeth bared. And outside, the wind howled. Branches shook violently as if something was trying to break free. Sarah whispered, "They're protecting themselves." The council members were pale. One by one, they stood. "We've seen enough. This claim is invalid. This land stays protected." Nate's entire plan crumbled in an instant. He spun toward Evelyn, eyes burning with fury. "You think this is over?" he hissed. But Evelyn wasn't afraid anymore. She looked him dead in the eye. "It was never yours to take." Nate Richards stormed out, his men following quickly behind. And just like that, the battle was over. The Guardians of the Paths. As the meeting ended, Luna sat quietly at the council table, her fingers still lightly tracing the symbol. Evelyn knelt beside her. "Did you know this would happen?" Luna didn't answer. Instead, she just looked out the window. Evelyn followed her gaze toward the forest, where the glowing symbols had begun to fade. The paths had closed themselves again. But now Evelyn understood. They had never been hers to protect. She had been chosen, just like her ancestors before her. The Guardians had always existed, and tonight the forest had accepted its own. Chapter 7. The Final Guardian. The battle was over, but the story of the forest was far from finished. The town council had ruled against Nate Richards. The forest was now protected. No one could claim it. No one could destroy it. But Evelyn knew this wasn't just about ownership. It was about something much older, something the forest had been waiting for all along. A new life for Luna. Luna was different now. She still didn't speak much, but she smiled more. She still preferred sleeping near the windows, watching the trees. But she no longer looked like she was waiting to run. She was home. She was safe. Evelyn had filed the adoption papers. Luna was hers now, not just a child from the forest, but a daughter. The girl who had once belonged to the wild was learning to live between two worlds. And Evelyn, she had learned to listen to her family's legacy, to the whispers of the paths, to the truth that had always been there. The forest was never meant to be controlled. It was meant to be protected. The final signs. One evening, Evelyn found Luna sitting in the front yard, carefully arranging small stones in the dirt. Another pattern, another message from the paths. Evelyn sat beside her. "What does it mean?" Luna looked up. Then she pointed toward Ranger. The German shepherd sat at the edge of the porch, ears pricked, watching the tree line, watching something unseen, the way his ancestors had, the way all guardians had. Evelyn followed his gaze toward the deepest part of the forest. She didn't understand it all, not yet, but she knew one thing: some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some are meant to be honored. A town forever changed. The events of the last few weeks had shaken Mill Creek to its core. People whispered, they avoided the forest, but they no longer tried to claim it, because they had seen, they had felt it, something older than history, something that refused to be erased. And for the first time, the town learned to respect it. Sarah had stayed for a while, helping Evelyn document the symbols, ensuring that the next guardian would understand. Carter, ever the skeptic, never said it aloud. But he knew. The paths were real, and he had walked among them. The Last Watch. On the first cold night of winter, Evelyn stepped onto the porch. Luna was asleep inside. The town had quieted. The paths had gone still. But Ranger was still watching, his golden eyes fixed on the darkness, as if waiting, as if guarding. Evelyn knelt beside him, her fingers running through his fur. "We did it," she whispered. Ranger didn't move, didn't blink, only stared toward the deep woods. And Evelyn knew it wasn't over. There would always be another mystery, another child, another guardian. The paths were quiet for now, but one day they would call again. And when they did, someone would be there to answer.